Imagine standing at your father's funeral, kneeling beside his casket, when the person you trusted most humiliates you in front of everyone. That moment seems unbearable, until you discover that what just happened was only the beginning. By the end of this story, the tables will turn, power will shift, and what you think you know about justice and family will be completely shattered. Stay with us until the very last moment. You won't believe what happens, and it will leave you absolutely speechless. Emily Carter was on her knees beside her father's casket when the slap came. It wasn't just a sound. It was a crack, sharp, violent, undeniable. It ricocheted off the beige walls of the New Hope Community Center and seemed to hang in the air long after Victoria Carter's hand dropped back to her side. Conversations froze mid-whisper. Programs stopped rustling. Even the soft hum of the air conditioner felt like it had shut itself off out of respect for the moment. Emily didn't fall. She didn't gasp. She stayed exactly where she was, one hand resting lightly on the polished wood of her father's coffin, the other gripping the folded funeral program so tightly it creased down the middle. Her cheek burned instantly, heat spreading beneath her skin, but she refused to touch it. Across from her stood her stepmother, Victoria, perfectly styled black dress, flawless makeup, diamond studs that caught the light every time she moved. Her chest rose and fell too quickly, like she had just finished a sprint. Her fingers trembled, not with regret, but with fear. "You embarrassed us," Victoria hissed, her voice low but cutting. "Embarrassed us." As if grief were a performance. As if compassion were a mistake. 10 minutes earlier, Emily had been seated in the front row, staring at a photo of her father, Michael Carter, in his favorite Navy suit. The same one he wore to church, business meetings, and community events. The photo captured his confident smile, the one that convinced investors to trust him and neighbors to admire him. To the outside world, he was a self-made success story. A man who built an empire from a single barber shop on the South Side. To Emily, he was more complicated than that. She had noticed the old man struggling at the entrance before anyone else did. Rain had soaked through his thin jacket. His wheelchair caught against the heavy glass door, and people who claimed they respected her father, looked everywhere except at him. At their phones. At the ceiling. At the weather. Victoria saw him too. Emily knew she did. But Victoria's gaze slid past the man like he was invisible, like inconvenience had no place at a carefully curated funeral. So Emily stood up. She ignored the sharp look from her stepmother and walked down the aisle in heels that echoed against the tile floor. She pushed the door open wide and held it steady against the wind. "Come on in," she had said softly. "There's room." The man had looked at her for a moment longer than necessary. Not grateful. Not helpless. Just observant. His eyes were clearer than she expected. That was it. That was the crime. Now, in front of everyone who mattered in their neighborhood, Victoria had decided to correct it. Emily slowly rose to her feet. She moved carefully, deliberately, the way she had learned to move over the last 6 years since her father married Victoria. Life in their house had required precision. Speak less. React slower. Never give anyone the satisfaction of seeing you break. Her cheek throbbed, but her eyes were steady. "I'm sorry," Emily said quietly. A ripple of confusion moved through the crowd. Victoria blinked. "Good," she replied too quickly. But Emily wasn't apologizing for helping the old man. She was apologizing for what was about to unfold, though she didn't yet understand why she felt that certainty settle into her chest like a stone. Behind them, near the doorway, the old man in the wheelchair remained still. Rainwater dripped from the rubber wheels onto the linoleum floor in small, rhythmic taps. His shoes didn't match. One was black, the other dark brown. His jacket sleeve was frayed at the elbow. Yet his posture was upright. Alert. Watching. The funeral resumed, but something fundamental had shifted. The pastor cleared his throat and continued reading scripture. Prayers were offered. Words about legacy and leadership filled the air. Still, the energy in the room felt fractured. People kept glancing at Emily's swelling cheek. No one approached her. Sympathy, she had learned long ago, had limits, especially when money and reputation were involved. Victoria stepped forward later to thank guests for coming, her voice suddenly soft, composed, almost fragile. Grief makes people act out, she explained to a small circle of women, offering a delicate smile. Emily heard it. She didn't react. Instead, she turned her attention back to the casket, to the finality of it, to the fact that whatever protection her father's presence once offered, however distant it had been, was now gone. A memory surfaced uninvited, being 16, standing outside her father's office behind the barber shop, overhearing Victoria say, "It's not personal. It's business." That word, business, had always seemed to justify everything. Exclusion. Decisions made without her. Silences that lasted months. Now business stood in a black dress, pretending a slap was discipline instead of fear. As the service ended and guests began filing out, the sound of rain returned, harder this time, drumming against the roof. Phones reappeared in hands. Messages were already being sent. The story was spreading, edited, reshaped, simplified. Daughter causes scene at father's funeral. No one would mention the door. Or the wheelchair. Emily remained near the exit as people passed. Some avoided eye contact. Others offered tight, performative smiles. The air smelled like wet coats and expensive perfume. Then she heard it. "Miss Carter." She turned. The old man looked up at her, his expression changed. Sharper now. Focused. There was no trace of frailty in his gaze. "Thank you," he said simply. "For what?" she almost asked. But something in his tone stopped her. It wasn't gratitude. It was acknowledgement. Their eyes held for a fraction longer than polite society required. In that silent exchange, something invisible locked into place, though Emily couldn't name it. Outside, thunder rolled across the sky. Inside, the test had already begun. And without knowing it, Emily Carter had just passed the first part. The will reading was scheduled for 2 days after the funeral. Not a week later. Not after the flowers died or the casseroles stopped coming. Michael Carter had never believed in delay. "Waiting makes people comfortable," he used to say. "Comfort makes them careless." The email arrived at exactly 8 a.m. sharp. Subject: Estate of Michael Carter. Mandatory attendance required. Location: Lawson and Reed, attorneys at law. Time: 10 a.m. Attendance required for claim verification. Claim verification. Emily read the phrase twice before locking her phone and setting it face down on the kitchen table of her small apartment. The sink still leaked if you ran it too long. The paint near the window had begun to peel. She had never moved into her father's house after he married Victoria. Distance had been the only boundary she controlled. She would attend. Not for the money. Not for closure. For clarity. The law office sat on the east side of downtown in a restored brick building that smelled faintly of old paper and polished wood. The kind of place that whispered permanence. The elevator creaked slightly as it rose, as if it too carried secrets. Victoria Carter arrived first. She always did. Control in her world started with positioning. She wore tailored gray instead of mourning black. Her makeup was softer than it had been at the funeral, but just as deliberate. Beside her stood her attorney, Bernard Hayes, thin, eager, adjusting his tie every few minutes like reassurance could be ironed into fabric. Victoria chose her seat at the long mahogany table without hesitation. Head of the room would have been too obvious. 2 seats from it was better. Strategic. Then she noticed something that unsettled her. Folders had been placed neatly at each chair. Each labeled in identical black print. Victoria Carter. Emily Carter. Same font. Same size. Her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Emily entered quietly 5 minutes before 10. No announcement. No greeting. Her coat was the same one she wore to the funeral. The faint bruise on her cheek had shifted from red to a dull yellow beneath her skin. She hadn't covered it. She wasn't hiding it. She took her seat and folded her hands in her lap. She didn't look at Victoria. Didn't acknowledge Bernard. Her gaze drifted instead to a framed quote on the office wall. "Character is what you do when nobody is watching." Her father's favorite line. The door opened precisely at 10 a.m. Conversation stopped. The old man from the funeral walked in. No wheelchair. No trembling hands. No torn jacket. He wore a perfectly tailored dark navy suit and carried a slim leather briefcase. His posture was upright, measured, controlled. The room went still in a way that felt heavier than shock. Victoria blinked first. "I don't understand," she said carefully. The man set his briefcase at the head of the table and opened it without rushing. "My name is Richard Lawson," he said evenly. "Senior executor of the Michael Carter estate." Silence deepened. He looked around the room, making eye contact with each person as though confirming attendance for something much larger than a will reading. 14 months ago, Lawson continued, Mr. Carter implemented a conditional review process regarding succession. Bernard leaned forward. "Conditional based on what?" "Character," Lawson replied. He tapped a button on the tablet in front of him. Around the table, phones began to vibrate. One. Then another. Then several at once. Emails flooded inboxes simultaneously. Account authorization update. Trust activation notice. Corporate access revision. Victoria's phone rang. She silenced it. It rang again almost immediately. "This must be a mistake," Bernard said, scrolling rapidly. "These corporate privileges have been reassigned," Lawson interrupted calmly. Victoria's composure began to crack at the edges. "Reassigned to whom?" she demanded. Lawson turned slightly. "To the designated successor." He slid a document across the table. Not toward Victoria. Toward Emily. The movement was quiet, deliberate. Every eye followed the paper as if it were explosive. Emily reached for it without hesitation. The first line wasn't financial. It wasn't legal jargon. It was handwritten and scanned into the official record. "If you're reading this, someone chose right when it would have been easier not to." Her breath caught, but only for a second. Victoria stood abruptly. "What is this?" Lawson clasped his hands lightly in front of him. 2 days ago, at the New Hope Community Center, Mr. Carter's final character evaluation concluded. Victoria's face drained of color. "You staged that," she whispered. "No," Lawson replied. "Your husband did. I merely executed his instructions." Phones continued buzzing. Bernard swallowed hard. "Victoria, your accounts, they're frozen pending review." "Review of what?" she snapped. "Of all transactions conducted under your authority within the Carter Family Trust over the past 10 years. The words landed like falling glass. Emily didn't smile. Didn't react outwardly. Inside, something shifted. Not triumph. Not shock. Recognition. Lawson's voice remained steady. Michael Carter believed that leadership without integrity collapses eventually. He wanted to ensure the estate would pass to the individual who demonstrated independent character when no reward was visible. He looked at Emily only briefly. "Miss Carter, you are now the sole controlling beneficiary of the Carter Family Trust and its subsidiaries." The room fractured. Victoria stared at Emily like she was seeing her for the first time, not as a daughter, not as an inconvenience, but as a threat realized too late. "You knew," Victoria said, her voice thinner now. "You had to know." Emily finally lifted her eyes to meet hers. "I knew my father," she said quietly. "That's all." Outside the window, sunlight cut through the clouds for the first time that week. Inside, power shifted without shouting. No dramatic announcement. No applause. Just systems updating. Authorizations transferring. control dissolving from one set of hands and settling into another. Lawson closed his briefcase. The test, he said calmly, was never about wealth. It was about who would choose correctly when no one was watching. He looked at Emily one final time. You did. And just like that, the evaluation was complete. The meeting ended without ceremony. No one congratulated Emily. No one argued loudly. There was no dramatic collapse, no shouting across the polished mahogany table. Just the quiet unraveling of control. Richard Lawson closed his briefcase with a soft click that felt louder than a gavel. Chairs scraped the floor as people stood too quickly, as if remaining seated might make the outcome reversible. Victoria did not move. Her phone vibrated again in her hand, shorter this time, almost impatient. She stared at the screen like it had betrayed her personally. Victoria, Bernard whispered, panic creeping into his voice. Your executive privileges have been revoked across all Carter subsidiaries. The board access codes. I heard you, she snapped, but there was no heat behind it anymore. Only disbelief. Emily rose when it felt natural, not rushed. She slid the document into her bag with deliberate care. It was strange how light the paper felt compared to the weight it carried. Emily. Victoria's voice cracked on her name. It wasn't a mother calling a daughter. It was a dethroned ruler calling the successor she never prepared for. Emily paused but didn't fully turn. You knew about this, Victoria said. You had to. Emily studied her for a moment. For the first time, Victoria didn't look intimidating. She looked exposed. Planning requires intent, Emily replied evenly. I just showed up. She walked out before Victoria could respond. Outside, the city moved like nothing had happened. Cars honked. A delivery truck double-parked. Someone argued loudly into a Bluetooth headset while crossing the street. Life continued at its usual speed, unaware that an empire had just changed hands inside a third-floor office. Emily's phone buzzed in her coat pocket. She hesitated before checking it. Carter Family Trust. Executive access granted. Board meeting scheduled. 24 hours. Primary authorization. Emily Carter. The words felt unreal, like they belonged to someone else with the same name. 4 years, she had been adjacent to power. Near it. Observing it. Excluded from it. Now it sat in her hands without warning. She turned the phone face down and started walking. Victoria's world began shrinking before she even reached her car. Her driver didn't arrive. Her corporate credit card declined at the parking gate. When she called the operations director to demand clarification, the call went straight to voicemail. By the time she reached the house she had redecorated twice in 5 years, the security gate hesitated before opening, long enough to make the message clear. Inside, the air felt different. Less hers. She dialed Bernard again. You told me this was airtight, she said as soon as he answered. It was, he insisted weakly. Unless your husband embedded contingency clauses that bypassed standard review. Contingency clauses, she repeated sharply. For moral breach, fiduciary misalignment, character failure, he finished carefully. Victoria laughed once. Short, humorless. You're telling me I lost everything because of a door? No, Bernard said. Because of what that door represented. She ended the call. For the first time in years, the house felt too large. Meanwhile, Emily sat at the small kitchen table in her apartment, laptop open. She logged into the secure portal Richard Lawson had activated. Layer after layer unfolded. Holding companies nested inside non-profits. Silent partnerships. Funds redirected under restructuring policies that looked clean on paper but shifted opportunity away from employees and into private reserves. Her father had seen it, tracked it, documented it, and waited. There were notes time-stamped months before his death. Observe reaction under stress. Verify loyalty versus ethics. Pressure reveals truth. Emily leaned back in her chair. So this hadn't been sudden. It had been calculated. Not to punish. To reveal. Her phone rang. Victoria. Emily let it ring twice before answering. You destroyed me, Victoria said immediately. No greeting. Emily closed her eyes, not in guilt, but in focus. You weren't destroyed, she replied calmly. You were corrected. Silence filled the line. You let him test me, Victoria continued. You stood there and let him humiliate me. I didn't know who he was, Emily said. Neither did you. Another silence. Heavier. Did you want this? Victoria asked finally. The question lingered in the space between them. Emily considered it honestly. For years she had wanted acknowledgement. Space. A voice. But this. I don't know yet, she answered. And that was the truth. The call ended without resolution. The next morning, headlines began circulating through business blogs. Carter estate shock succession. Widow loses control in strategic transfer. Daughter named sole beneficiary after conditional review. Speculation filled in the blanks facts couldn't reach. Emily ignored it. Instead, she prepared for the board meeting. 24 hours later, she stood at the head of a long glass conference table inside Carter Industries headquarters. The room felt colder than it should have. All steel and glass. Minimalist. Controlled. 12 board members watched her carefully. Some wary. Some calculating. Some already adapting. Richard Lawson stood to her right. No introduction was made. It wasn't necessary. Emily sat in the center seat. No one objected. The first agenda item wasn't profits. It was audit findings. Richard tapped his tablet, and screens lit up around the room. Transaction summaries. Restructure approvals. Department eliminations. Over the past decade, he began, certain resource reallocations exceeded their stated purpose. A board member cleared his throat. All decisions were within executive authority at the time. Authority, Emily said quietly, isn't the same as integrity. Every eye shifted to her. She didn't raise her voice. How many jobs were cut during these restructures? She asked. Richard glanced at the data. Approximately 800 directly. Indirectly, more. The number hung in the air. Emily felt it settle. Bring them back, she said. Confusion rippled through the room. That would require reversing multiple active cost strategies, someone argued. I know, she replied. Do it anyway. Silence. Then keyboards began clicking. Emails drafting. Power wasn't loud. It was operational. Precise. And for the first time in her life, Emily understood something clearly. Inheritance wasn't money. It was responsibility amplified. As the meeting adjourned, Richard walked beside her down the hallway overlooking the city. You could have left things unchanged, he said. No one would have challenged you. That's the problem, Emily answered. No one was challenging anything. He studied her for a moment. Your father believed pressure reveals truth. Emily looked out at the moving traffic below. Pressure also breaks things that were never built to carry it. The wind rattled faintly against the glass. Inside the building, systems updated. Policies shifted. Calls were made. Power had changed hands. Quietly. And for the first time, it belonged to someone who hadn't asked for it, but wasn't running from it either. 3 weeks after the boardroom takeover, Emily Carter walked through Carter Industries' main warehouse. The space had been empty for years, abandoned and dusty, but now it hummed with life. Forklifts moved carefully along the polished concrete floors. Workers called out instructions over the low rumble of machinery. Lunch trucks lined the street outside, and the smell of coffee and fried food mingled with the scent of oil and cardboard. A man approached, wiping grease from his hands. They told us you brought us back, he said quietly, almost in disbelief. I mean, that we got our jobs again. Emily nodded, keeping her expression neutral. She had been asked that question countless times in her mind before she ever heard it aloud. "Why?" he pressed, voice tinged with hope. Emily paused, considering how to answer without simplifying the truth. "Because it was wrong," she said finally. "Simple. Clear. Honest." He smiled, relief washing over his face. "That's rare," he admitted. "Somebody just saying that without a whole speech behind it." And it was rare. She knew it. In a world that often measured leadership in profit margins and public image, acknowledgement of fairness was scarce. Later that afternoon, she sat in one of her father's houses, the first time she'd ever stepped inside since Victoria Carter had married Michael. The house felt too large, too quiet. The furniture was expensive, but sterile, like it was meant to impress, not comfort. In his study, Emily found a locked drawer in the massive oak desk. Inside was a notebook, its leather cover soft and worn, and on the first page, her name was written in Michael Carter's familiar handwriting. She read until the sun had dipped below the horizon. The words weren't apologies. They weren't confessions. They were observations. Records of choices made and doubts expressed. There were notes on people he trusted, and people he didn't. Pages questioned whether wealth could ever be passed down without corrupting the soul of those who inherited it. One passage stopped her cold. "If you're reading this after I'm gone, then you've been tested by circumstances I created. I hope I was wrong to think this was necessary. I am afraid I wasn't." Emily closed the notebook, feeling a pressure behind her eyes she refused to name. Power, she realized, had consequences even when wielded justly. Justice wasn't applause. It wasn't recognition. It wasn't the kind of victory that made you feel warm inside. It was measured, operational, quiet. Victoria Carter had shown up unannounced the next morning. Emily did not invite her in. She remained in the space that had once been her father's, now her own, calm and collected. Victoria's posture was smaller than it had been, less imposing, more uncertain. "You planned this," Victoria said, voice tight but cautious. "My father did," Emily replied, choosing her words carefully. "I just was myself." "No games, no masks left," Victoria said, trying to regain some semblance of control. "Convenient," Emily answered softly. "You won either way." Victoria laughed, bitter and dry. "You don't get to feel guilty and powerful at the same time." "Why not?" Emily asked. Her eyes met Victoria's. Silence stretched between them. It was unspoken, but understood. This wasn't about revenge. It was about correction. About accountability. Victoria finally left, and Emily sat alone. The systems she had activated were working. Injustices were being corrected quietly, efficiently. But the victory was not comfortable. It was sober. Justice without applause was heavier than most people ever realized. Later, Emily began funding a new initiative, one she didn't place under the Carter Family Trust or even her own name. A legal defense network for people hurt by restructurings they never controlled. It was quiet, small, intentional. A subtle shift in a world that had already tried to measure her in dollars and corporate titles. On the anniversary of her father's death, she returned to the steps of the community center where it had all started. Standing there, she tried to remember the weight of the moment she had knelt before the casket. The innocence, the simplicity, the clarity of choice. Memory had been edited by consequence, and the lesson was indelible. Justice often requires action without recognition, courage without applause, and decisions that ripple far beyond the room you occupy. Emily stood in the quiet city air and considered it all. Power was hers now. Justice had been enacted. But she knew, deep down, that neither mercy nor consequence would ever be simple. The quiet was a reminder that every choice came at a price, and some prices were paid silently, long after the world had moved on. 18 months had passed since Emily Carter had assumed control of the Carter Family Trust. The world had settled around her, not with fanfare or celebration, but with quiet acknowledgement. Carter Industries ran efficiently. Disputes had dwindled. Audits passed with precision. Emily's name appeared in headlines only when necessary, usually next to words like steady, effective, or unemotional. She wasn't photographed smiling. She wasn't asked to speak at leadership events. The market trusted her. People weren't sure what to make of her. Emily sat in her smaller office, the one she had chosen over the expansive corner suite in the main tower. From here, she could watch the neighborhood where she had grown up, the streets alive with vendors, children, and the constant hum of life. It was a grounding view, a reminder that empire and money existed, but so did humanity. Richard Lawson, older now, or perhaps just wearier, stood at the front of the room during her quarterly review. "The transition is complete," he said, voice steady. "By every measure, the estate is healthy." Emily didn't applaud. She didn't celebrate. She had learned that power was not performance. It was responsibility. Later, she found herself reflecting on her father's notebook again. The final pages contained no instructions for wealth, no list of beneficiaries, no last-minute warnings about Victoria Carter. Instead, they were records of observation. Notes about choices, about character, about the subtle ways people reveal themselves under pressure. One line resonated more than any other. Power shows you who you are. It doesn't ask permission first. She understood now. Inheriting an empire was not inheriting certainty. It was inheriting consequences. Decisions made by those who came before her now intersected with her own choices, shaping outcomes she could not fully anticipate. A month later, she received a handwritten letter. The sender was a man whose department had been cut during the early freezes she had reversed. "You were right to fix things," it read. And then a reflection on a younger generation. "But my son doesn't believe systems care about fairness anymore. He thinks they only care about what works. I don't know if you taught him that, or if the world did. I only know he learned it when we lost everything." Emily folded the letter and placed it with her father's notebook. She understood now. Inheritance was never just wealth. It was vigilance. Ethics. The quiet work of righting wrongs and holding decisions accountable over decades. On the anniversary of her father's death, she returned to the community center steps, the same place she had knelt 18 months prior. The rain was soft, barely a drizzle. She tried to remember the precise weight of that moment. The innocence, the fear, the clarity of choice. Memory had been edited by consequence, but the lessons remained. She paused, reflecting on mercy and justice, power and responsibility. What did it mean to act correctly in a world that often rewarded cunning over compassion? Could she carry this inheritance without losing herself to its weight? Later that week, Emily ran into Victoria at a charity event. There was no planning, no manipulation. Life had a way of creating intersections. Victoria looked adjusted, not defeated, not entirely recovered. Emily's eyes met hers briefly. "You built something impressive," Victoria said, watching the people move through the room. Emily thought quietly. Impressive, yes, but not kind. Not easy. Not without cost. "Did it ever love you back?" she asked silently, more to herself than to Victoria. Victoria smiled faintly. "No. But I thought it needed me." They parted without forgiveness. Months passed, and Emily began funding initiatives quietly. A legal defense network, advocacy for displaced workers, protections for those hurt by corporate restructuring. It ran under a different name, outside the Carter Trust, small and intentional. The work wasn't glamorous. It wasn't headline-grabbing. But it mattered. On the anniversary of her father's passing, Emily once again sat at the small table in her apartment, the place where she had first ignored the flood of emails that had changed everything. She opened the notebook one last time. On the final page, her father had written, "Power shows you who you are. It doesn't ask permission first." Outside, the city moved forward, indifferent, operational, alive. Emily had inherited an empire, corrected injustices, and learned that justice without mercy carried its own heavy weight. She carried it now, quietly, deliberately, with awareness that each choice could ripple for decades, reshaping the lives of strangers and family alike. In the end, the empire endured. What became of it, and of her, was still unwritten. And for the first time, she felt the quiet truth of responsibility. Inheritance is never a gift. It is a test. And the test never ends.